Paul's going to do what Paul is going to do.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and as always, you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball and on Instagram at redrock_bball as well, and facebook.com/redrockbasketball. We are here today to look at the Indiana Pacers 2016-17 series. So,
let's get to it.
Not series, season. That's the word I'm looking for. If you missed it yesterday, I had a 2017 NBA draft preview with Sam Vecini go live. We chatted for a little bit over an hour, and I think there's a ton of good information in there. I will be doing another NBA draft pod next week, probably Monday or Tuesday next week. So stay tuned for that with a different NBA draft expert. So we'll chat about the players that we didn't cover in that show with Sam, but I reckon you'll get a ton of information out of that show with Sam, who's fantastic. He works over at the Sporting News, and you should also check out his podcast, the Game Theory Podcast. We're going to talk Indiana Pacers now. For whatever reason, a lot of people were really excited about them heading into this season. You can count me as not one of those. People were predicting them they were going to be the 2 seed. They were going to be challenging up there, better than the Celtics, better than the Raptors, because they signed Jefferson. Yeah, cool. To me, it was a weird offseason from the Pacers. The addition of Thaddeus Young was a decent one. The trade of George Hill for Jeff Teague was a downgrade. Jefferson is cooked at this point. Thankfully, they didn't play him in a large role, but that never was going to tip them over the edge. And Paul George had his struggles at times during the season, but obviously flew home at the end of the year to get this team into the playoffs and provided a little bit of a challenge to the Cavs. Despite getting swept, they were able to challenge them in 1 or 2 games in that series. He's a conundrum, Paul George. We'll talk about him in a second. Let's talk about this team's record. They were 42-40. They overperformed their point differential by just the 2 wins, so about sort of where they needed to be. If you look at them in the draft, they got pick 18 and pick 47. Wouldn't be stunned if they trade that pick. We've heard whispers coming out now that Larry Bird's not around for the Pacers in an official role anymore. That they're looking to perhaps try and strengthen the squad with veterans to encourage another rebuild, or not rebuild, a re-strengthening around Paul George to encourage him to stay when his contract runs out at the end of next season. I think that is absolutely fraught with danger, and it won't go well. They won't challenge. They won't be good. They'll be mediocre. They might as well just call themselves the Chicago Bulls. They'll just be mediocre and they'll lose Paul George. And I think that's what will happen. I don't think that they are going to trade him in this offseason. They may trade him during the season. I don't think that it happens during this offseason. I don't think that he ends up getting traded to the Lakers if he gets traded anywhere. But he will likely head there in free agency, all reports. I'm not a massive Paul George fan. You're all well aware of that. Let's look at their free agency. They've got a few things that they need to take care of. Number one is Jeff Teague, who they did get in that trade for George Hill. He's an unrestricted free agent. He's going to command a lot more than what he is currently on salary-wise. So that could be an interesting scenario for this team as to how much they pay him. Now, if they're looking to strengthen around Paul George, they'll bring him back. I don't think there's too much doubt in that. They're not getting Chris Paul to go there. Steph Curry's not leaving the Warriors and going there. So I don't think there's any concern about any big name going there. So Teague looks like he'll be back and looks like he'll be paid and probably be overpaid. Now, he was absolutely horrendous to start the year, but he had a decently strong year, which we'll talk about during the rest of the podcast. The other guys they've got to take care of. CJ Myles opted out of his player option. He's an unrestricted free agent. He is a real key player, and the term 3-and-D gets thrown around in the NBA a lot. Oh, he's going to be a 3-and-D guy. He's going to be a 3-and-D guy, but almost, or maybe I'd say 50% of the time at least, those players aren't 3-and-D guys because either A, they suck at shooting threes, or B, they can't play defense. There are very few players who are legitimate 3-point shooters and defenders, and that's what their role is. CJ Myles is one of those. You could probably put Bob Cove in that sort of role as well, but some of the other guys get thrown, he's going to be a 3-and-D wing. They can't shoot or they can't defend. Myles is one of those guys who can actually do both, and he does have a real lot of value for this team. They've also got Aaron Brooks, who's an unrestricted free agent. I wouldn't be too keen on bringing him back. Lavoy Allen has a $4 million team option. I would exercise that. I think Lavoie Allen he had a pretty decent stretch at the end of the year, and I think he can be a solid rotational big. They've got a stack of non-guaranteed deals. Kevin Seraphin at $1.8 million non-guaranteed. I'd guarantee that. Raheem Christmas at $1.5 million. I'd guarantee that. Mighty Joe Young at $1.5 million non-guaranteed. Well, I would have guaranteed that, but I don't know what the hell happened to him this season. He was an absolute disaster. After a pretty promising rookie year, he fell off completely. The little dog, Glenn Robinson III, it's a no-brainer. That is guaranteed for sure. While George Niang at $1.5 million non-guaranteed. I don't think he's only been there for 1 year, barely played. I don't think he showed enough to say that's a definite decision that needs to be made, and he needs to be guaranteed. It depends on if they need that $1.5 million in cap space, and they could clear obviously his 1.5, Joe Young's 1.5, and maybe even Raheem Christmas to give them that extra $4.5 million worth of cap space if that's what they require. In terms of their rankings for the year, 15th in offensive rating, 16th in defensive rating. So quite clearly, smack bang right in the middle. They were 26th in three-point attempt rate, but 4th in three-point percentage, meaning that they hit their threes, they just didn't take them. So that's an offensive structure failure. And part of that is, the other thing I didn't talk about in the offseason is Larry Bird downgrading from Frank Vogel to Nate McMillan. It was a horrible decision at the time, and it was still horrible. McMillan is not a good coach, and he was not a good coach. And when you're shooting that well from three, you got to take more of them. They were 24th in offensive rebounding percentage, but they were second in free throw percentage, which is good that they can hit those free throws. You see teams that struggle at line. That's 3 points, as indicated by the name free throws. The best offensive rating on the team went to Jeff Teague.
My name is Jeff.
Myles Turner, CJ Miles, and Raheem Christmas, while the best defensive rating went to Myles Turner, Thaddeus Young, Al Jefferson, and Big Paulie George. They had 5 blokes shoot over 40% on corner threes, and one of those was Lance Stephenson, who attempted just 1 corner three in his time in Indiana. In fact, he took 8 threes in his time with Indiana and hit one of them, and that was a corner three. So, yeah, he's not a good three-point shooter, but when you look at those corner three numbers, you go, shit, 100%, that's pretty good. Yeah, 1 shot and then missed all 7 others of his shots. The other 4 guys to hit 40%, no surprise that it's CJ Miles, Glenn Robinson III, Paul George, and Aaron Brooks. Lance, though, in Indiana, in his limited time there, did finish at 71% at the rim. That's obviously impressive, as is CJ Miles' 63%. Not that he goes to the rim all that often, but the fact that he was able to finish is a bonus. While Aaron Brooks, who was putrid for most of the year, he was at 42% at the rim. Jeff Teague and Aaron Brooks, just an extraordinarily low percentage of their 2-point attempts were assisted. 9.6%, both exactly the same, which is ridiculously low. You see guys at point guards at 15, 20%, but under 10% is crazy. That, again, it screams to me just poor offensive structure. And it's clearly a system that they're running, that the point guard is going to take shots when he's dribbling, and that's it. He's not going to be any sort of spot-up threat, or the ball goes to Paul George. It doesn't necessarily come out as much. It goes into the post. It doesn't come out. There's just less ball movement. That's an extraordinarily low amount for Teague and Brooks in this Indiana offense. Their PER, their advanced stats leaders, Paul George led in PER at only 20.1, which is not that high of a number. True shooting was CJ Miles at 59.2, and usage is Paul George at 28.9. But some of the other advanced numbers, I think you'd be surprised at who led the team. Win shares, it was Jeff Teague at 8.1. In fact, Paul George was 3rd on the team in win shares. Win shares per 48 went to Myles Turner. Offensive box score plus minus, George. Defensive, Myles Turner. And then Paul George led overall box score plus minus and led in VORP as well. But it wasn't a case, and this is what people always ask, who's a better trade option, Jimmy Butler or Paul George? And I will always say Jim Butler. I think that he is a better option. Butler just destroyed the Bulls in terms of every number. He was the team leader in pretty much everything. George, not so much, and he does have his downfalls. And again, I will always caveat this by saying I am not the biggest Paul George fan in the world from a basketballing sense, and from a general leadership perspective. I'm not sure that he's a good player in that sort of an aspect. Lineups, they had 6 lineups over 100 minutes, so that's a pretty good distribution of using their best guys together. Their most used lineup was not a great one. Teague and Monta Ellis, which is it's a horrendous combination. Paul George, Myles Turner, and Thaddeus Young, that was a negative 2.4. Eventually, Monta Ellis moved out of that starting lineup after an injury, and they didn't bring him back. And they should have been limiting his minutes pretty much all season, and they did. And then they, again, stupidly started bringing him back into bigger minutes. Their best lineup did have Teague and Ellis in it, but it was interestingly, it had the little dog, Glenn Robinson, instead of Paul George. So basically that starting lineup, but with Robinson instead of George. So Turner and Young, and that was a plus 12 in over 100 minutes, which I don't think many people would have expected to see that being their best lineup. Their most used four-man, George, Teague, Turner, Young, was a plus 4 without Ellis, no surprise. While their best four-man, Lavoie, Paul George, Teague, and Turner, and that was a plus 13.9. So Lavoie Allen replacing Thaddeus Young in that grouping. Their best three-man, George, Turner, and Teague, plus 4.3. Best three-man, George, Myles, and Turner at plus 7.7. Again, these names, there's some pretty consistent names here. Like you're seeing CJ Myles appear, Myles Turner in all these lineups. Their most used two-man, Paul George and Jeff Teague, it was a positive. Of course it was. Their best two-man, Paul George and CJ Myles, which I think would surprise a lot of people as well, and that was a plus 5.6. Let's get into these players. Let's talk about them. Let's break them down in a bit of extra detail. The first player is the guy, of course, we have to start with Paul George, who played 75 games this season and played 36 minutes a game and ended the year as the 16th ranked player in fantasy basketball. He had a decent start to the season and then did start to fade, as has been the pattern throughout his career. But unlike previous seasons, he was able to buck that trend and really pick it up in that second half of the year. And he went from 21st pre-All-Star to 14th post-All-Star with a bump in his numbers. And that's always a positive sign. For the year, he averaged 24 points, 6.5 boards, 3.5 assists with 2.5 threes and 1.6 steals, and shot an efficient 46 and 90 with 39% from three. After the All-Star break, he took his scoring up to 26 points a game. He got his rebounding up to 7.5. The steals and assists all stayed the same. He hit more threes, but his efficiency went up massively. He had a true shooting of 62%. He was absolutely flying after the All-Star break, and it is going to leave a pretty sweet taste in owners' mouths when they look at him in terms of drafting for next season. They might be, you can look at the rankings on here. His overall roto ranking on Basketball Monster, of course, for that post-All-Star period was 6th. So people might be tempted to think that he is a no-brainer top 10 pick. I don't believe that he is, but I think he's a fairly strong guy in that 9 to 16 range. John Wall, Chris Paul, LeBron James, Paul George, Nikola Jokic, those sort of players. Damian Lillard, he is in that group of guys. But George and Lillard are two guys who really came on strong at the end of the year and will give people some definite thoughts as to whether they should be drafting them in the top 10. I don't believe that will be the case. If George goes to another team, if he goes to Boston, then yes, some of his numbers will take a hit, but a lot of it doesn't just come from scoring. It comes from the rebounding, the assists, the steals. That efficiency should be pretty good. It's just that scoring might drop, and that might take him from the 12th guy to the 18th guy or the 19th guy if he was to end up in Boston. If he was to go to the Lakers, then shit, everything's got a chance to rise in that sort of a situation. But he was, and I think I'm pretty fair when I assess players. There are guys that I do like. There are guys that I don't like, and I criticise George plenty for some of his off-court stuff, for the way that his play declines, and for his general just level of play. But if I'm being fair, which I do try to do, he was great in that second half of the season, and he would have been a key factor in many fantasy championships with that strong end of the season that he had, really just dominating things and putting up huge numbers, showing that the sort of fantasy potential that he can have. So he was great down that stretch there. There's no doubt about that. He was a team best plus 9.3 in the on-off if you exclude Lance Stephenson's limited role, which amazingly Lance was at 12.6 in that time that he was in Indiana, which of course he only played 6 games and 132 minutes, but he was a plus 12.6, and for some reason he did look at home again in Indiana. He's never going to be a great player because he just isn't, but he looked more settled in Indiana than he had in, say, Minnesota or Charlotte or Los Angeles or Memphis or wherever else that he ended up throughout the season, or throughout the last couple of seasons. Myles Turner, pretty big hopes on him coming into the season. Real chance. I think we had him projected as like a top 35 guy, top 40 guy. Ended the season as the 32nd ranked player, took a massive step forward. And, I think that there's massive room for him to actually get better than this. And I think he's a top 20 staple for years to come. Now, he did struggle a little bit down the stretch. We saw times when he just wasn't getting the shot attempts. And that was definitely frustrating that he just wasn't as active. And his field goal percentage dropped in that time as well. He was 51 for the course of the year. But after the All-Star break, he was just at 49. And while 49 still seems good, it's not what you want from a centre who was a 52, 53 sort of a guy beforehand. For the year, Myles Turner averaged 14.5 and 7. Half a three, 1.3 assists, 0.9 steals, and 2.1 blocks. But that 51 and 81 combination, accompanied with 34% from three, really made for an excellent fantasy play. And I said he can get better than this. Jeff Teague took 11 shots per game. He took 10.7. I think that Turner should be developing into the second option. Not that he was pretty close to the second option, but he should become the clear second option on this team. And they start to utilize him more offensively in a Kristaps Porzingis type of role as he splits out to three. He's going to have a little bit more faith in himself, but they've got to also have a little bit more faith in him. His rebounding can be a problem. But his defensive stuff, his shot blocking is fantastic. His free throws are great. And he could be a guy that averages 17 and 8 with a 3, with 2.3 blocks, with a steal, and shoots 53 and 83. And that's clear top 20 in my opinion. So that's... If people who own him were a little bit sour on him, and I've seen the comments on some of the boards around, Myles Turner was a disappointment, I'm not taking him in the top 30 next year. If that sort of mentality is around in your Dynasty League from someone that owns Myles Turner, go and get him. Go and throw a low ball at him and take him, because I think that you have got a top 20 player there for the next 5 to 6 seasons. He's looked great in his time in the NBA. A marginal struggle at the end of the season, but that is the best time to acquire someone in a Dynasty League when they struggle to end a year, because it does leave that sour taste in people's mouths. So I think, and again, he's young. He's heading into his 3rd season only. I'm really, really pumped to see what Myles Turner can do. So, yeah, bring him on. He was also a plus 8.2 with his on-off, which is obviously pretty impressive.
My name is Jeff.
Jeff Teague. What a horrendous start to the season that Teague had. It was never going to continue at that rate because he was shooting at about 20% from the field. That was never going to be the case. And in the end, he had a pretty strong year. He played 82 games, averaged 15, 4, and 8 with 1.1 threes, 1.2 steals, shot 44 and 87 with 36% from three. Now, I was a little bit concerned with Teague heading across to Indiana because I thought that they would continue to run Monta Ellis, and that was a concern earlier in the start of the year, but he took his assist rate up phenomenally. Now, part of the problem with a point guard playing in Indiana like a George Hill is they did defer a lot to Ellis, and they deferred a lot to George. That wasn't the case with the way McMillan ran things with Teague, and he was able to get those assists. So 7.7 made him an extremely valuable player for this team. The efficiency was fine. He wasn't able to repeat his 40% three-point shooting season, which is not a surprise, but overall his efficiency was able to increase. He got to the line more often. He still hit the threes. He rebounded the ball better, and he was strong. I don't see any way that he's not back in Indiana next season, and I can see these numbers continuing from Jeff Teague. He did have a little bit of a fade post All-Star where he dropped to 67th in that time frame, but he, to me, is going to be, if they're going to continue to run the offense this way, which I see no reason why they won't, especially with Monta Ellis being even more limited now than what he was at the start of the season, then you're going to see it's going to be Teague, George, Turner, and Ellis is going to be in a much smaller role. So I got no problem with him being able to exceed 7 assists a game again and get those 15 points, 4 boards, the steal, the 3, and that solid but not spectacular efficiency. So I think that he is a strong top 50 guy for at least the next 2 seasons. I don't think that Jeff Teague is a great NBA player. I think he was a significant downgrade on George Hill, but for fantasy, he was obviously a better option as they changed coaching staff and used him in a different way and ran that offense in a different way as Ellis was reduced in his role and his playing time on this team. So Teague ended up being, I think you could say, a pretty decent success after I thought there was a chance that he would regress. I got it wrong, and I'm happy to admit that he didn't regress, obviously, than that big increase in his assist, which is really what what brought his rank up from 56 to 35 is the fact that he increased his assists by 1.8 per game, and that's enough to throw that ranking out by 20 spots. And that's just how sensitive these rankings can be. That's how little it takes to actually change them by 2 rounds, which is what happened there with Jeff Teague. The Deuce Young came across in that trade for the draft pick, which ended up being Karis LeVert. I would have liked the Pacers to have kept that and had a crack at LeVert and just get some young talent on this team, but I understand why they did it to get Thad across. He played 34 games. No, he didn't. He played 74 games and 30 minutes a game. Really a tale of two halves for Young. He was the 75th ranked player for the season, 67th pre-All-Star, 164th post. And that was that wrist injury that just really bothered him. He could not get anything to fall. He had no confidence in his shot whatsoever. For the season, Thad Young shot 53%. After the All-Star break, he shot a putrid 39% from the free throw line. He did shoot 54% from the field, but he wasn't as active. He wasn't able to get the rebounds. He wasn't as aggressive playing for those steals, which is such a big part of what Young's value is. For the year, 11-6 with 1.5 assists and 1.5 steals. He's never going to be a shot blocker, but he is an elite steal source as a power forward. And that free throw percentage is bad, but he takes 1 attempt a game. So it is far from unrecoverable from. In fact, it's not even a -1 in Z-score. That's how limited that is. 52%, but 1.2 attempts. I think that he can probably get more than the 30 minutes a game next season, given that he only played 28 a game after the All-Star break due to that wrist injury. So I would expect for him to be in that 70 to 50 range. As I said, he finished 75th for the year. And a big chunk of him falling at that end of the year was that drop in steals. I think that can return from him. I think he'll be all right. He also started taking more 3-pointers, which is something he basically eliminated in Brooklyn. But he also saw his subpar rebounding return, and that was something that disappeared in Brooklyn as well, which is a weird thing. That he was a poor rebounder in Philly and Minnesota. Went to Brooklyn, was averaging like 9 rebounds a game. Left and became more a perimeter player, got his threes back up, his rebounds went back down. And that was sort of predicted. You could sort of see that happening. I wasn't really keen on those rebounds staying up, and I don't think that they rebound, pun unintended, I don't think they rebound this season to back at that Brooklyn 9 per game level. I think we're looking at what he sort of did, but maybe an extra couple of minutes, which pushes him up a round or two. The team was 5.6 points better off with him on the court, so a positive on-off there for Thad Young in, I guess, a relatively successful season again, but it does rob the Pacers of any sort of young talent or young star that they could have by having that Karis LeVert pick. They didn't know that LeVert was going to be around. They didn't know what faith they had. So I understand the move 100%, and I can't fault them for that trade. In fact, it probably is a win for them in the long run. But, having some sort of young talent would be ideal at some point. CJ Myles. In and out of lineups, as has always been the case throughout his career. He played 76 games and 23 minutes a game. The 157th ranked player, he had stretches where he was a useful guy because he was getting big minutes, he was hitting threes, and he can get you steals. But he is as streaky as they come. He's injury prone. His form fluctuates almost more than anybody in the entire NBA. The team was 2.7 points per 100 possessions better off with him on the court. And and this is again something that you heard as an overarching theme throughout these podcasts. You can get threes in so many spots. He averaged 2.2 threes per game in 23 minutes. Over a half a steal, 90% from the line. You can get those threes. So people whose value is really propped up by their three-point shooting, you can get it from guys who aren't owned in every situation. And getting 2.2 threes from CJ Myles, that's just something you can bank on. Does he return to Indiana? I think they really need him. I think that he provides a key pairing with George, enables George to play at the 4 in some lineups. I think they need him. To me, he's a better option than what Monta Ellis is. But his fantasy value is always going to be precariously perched on the sort of the fringes of a 12-team league. And I can't envisage any situation where he goes to another team and I go, shit, you know what, I must draft CJ Myles now. Because he just doesn't have that fantasy upside, and all his value is really coming from those 3-pointers. Because despite shooting 90% from the free throw line, he takes 1 attempt there. So like the Deuce Young was taking one attempt a game and shooting 50%, and it wasn't a big negative. Shooting 90% at one attempt is not a big positive at all. It's only like a plus 0.37 in Z score, which is nowhere near that value. In fact, Myles Turner's 81% on 3.7 attempts is significantly better than what CJ Myles is able. It's about the same in terms of value for what CJ Myles does, despite him shooting 10% less from the line. Monta Ellis, he's bad. The team was 2.3 points better off with him on the bench. Unsurprisingly, his fantasy relevance is done. He was the 174th ranked player this season in just 27 minutes. Started off with a lot of minutes, was phased into limited minutes, and started to push back up at the end of the season. Averaged just 8.5 points and barely took any shots. 0.6 threes, 2.7 rebounds, 3 assists and a steal at 44, 73 and 32%. He's not a good three-point shooter. We know that. But he just was extraordinarily passive. And that can be a good thing because he didn't take the bad shots and he deferred to the other guys like Teague, like Turner, like George. And that's, I guess, a sign of maturity from Monta, that he was able to realize that and give those guys more shots rather than him just jacking himself completely out of the rotation. But in terms of his overall fantasy value, the only positive comes from the fact that he did get 3 assists a game and makes him one of those guys that you can stream for assists and steals. Can I get assists? Can I get steals? Where on the wire? Hey, Monta Ellis can do that. But he's giving me 8 points. He's giving me no threes. He's giving me blur sort of percentages. Nothing really enticing in those numbers. And I think it's only going to get worse for Monta. They're not bringing any free agent in, I don't think, necessarily to replace him, but I think they'll be more likely to go with a little dog there or a CJ Myles there, or maybe they even go Lance Stephenson there for next season and play him at the 2 rather than Ellis. Whatever it is, Ellis is not playing 30 minutes a game. He might not even play 25 minutes a game. I think he might struggle to get to that. I think he's going to be, and they do have problems with their backup point guard spot, and I think that's Monta's role now. Aaron Brooks was shit. Joe Young was terrible and played only, I think he only played 8. Well, he didn't. So he played 30. Only played 33 games and 4 minutes a game. That's like 120 minutes for the season. Yeah, that's really bad. And Brooks was terrible as well. So Monta's role is best as a backup point guard. If they can get another guard in there, another shooting guard, whether that's whoever that is, really, whether it's, I can't even think of. They'd love to get a guy like JJ Redick. I don't think they're going to be able to do that. But anyone else, Robinson, Myles, Stephenson, I think all those guys are better off at playing that 2 position and having Monta run as the backup 1. And that, to me, is going to see his minutes go down from that 27 down to probably low 20s. And then his fantasy value really does evaporate and he becomes that guy that's not really even close to being a standard league player. The little dog. Real surprising season from Glenn Robinson. He played 69 games.
Giggity.
21 minutes a game, 6 points, 4 rebounds, over half a steal, 0.7 threes, 47 and 71 and 40% from 3 for a true shooting of 57%. I thought that he was relatively impressive in what he was able to do this season. It's not something I necessarily thought that I'd be saying about Glenn Robinson. At the start of the year when George missed some time, he moved in and he put up some big games. But when he was inserted into the starting lineup in place of Monta Ellis, any fantasy appeal that he had disappeared because he just played his role to perfection, which was to be pretty much invisible on offense and let Teague, George and Turner run things, with Young being the 4th option. And to be honest, even in a 5-man lineup, it felt like he was about the 8th option in that lineup. He just did not touch the ball. And despite showing that he could do it, just the way that they ran the team, it gives you that indication that he was never going to be able to do it. What's his fantasy upside? Well, he can be a fairly strong rebounder. He hits the threes, he can get steals, and he can score. But in this situation in Indiana, it would require a Paul George injury, in my opinion, for him to, or Paul George to leave, for him to become that guy that they could develop into a starter and a top 100 player. Now, in saying that, the odds of Paul George leaving for you guys in dynasty leagues in the next year, it's pretty bloody high. And I don't know if Indiana would bring someone else in or they get Brandon Ingram back if they do a trade, or whatever they do. Jay Crowder comes in. But there is absolutely a non-zero chance of Glenn Robinson III being the starting small forward for this team and playing 28 to 30 minutes a night within the next 12 months. I think it's a decent chance, and that would push him to the top 100 if Paul George isn't around. So don't write that off. With George around, his value is just extraordinarily limited because he plays next to George, he rebounds, that's it. That's all he does. And that's fine because that's fitting the need of what the team does. But there is that chance that Paulie leaves. Lots of variables. And people always ask me, who benefits if so-and-so gets traded? Because it depends. What if Crowder comes back? What if Ingram comes back? Yeah, these are guys who just slot straight in and take that position and play 30 minutes, and Robinson's in the same boat. They probably wouldn't hog the ball as much as what Paul George does, so give him a little bit more offensive opportunity, but it wouldn't be just a straight, he is now becoming Paul George. It's not as simple as that. So we can go back to him at the start of the year. He had a 16 and 11 game. He had a 20 and 6 game. He had a 3-game stretch where he started in November. 20 and 6, 17 and 6, 15 and 4. He had a nice 12 and 12 double-double in December, a 12 and 10 double-double at the end of December, a couple of nice double-digit scoring games, a 19 and 6 game where he started in February. He has got the skills, but when everyone was healthy, as we saw down the season, his last 10 games of the year, he didn't even crack 20 minutes. But it's a long-term, hope for the best, sort of swing for the fences move, and if it pays off, I think you could have a really useful fantasy player. I don't think that Glenn Robinson's a great player, but he surprised me a lot this season and was impressive, and that's something this team does need. Al Jefferson. Talk about Monta Ellis being cooked. Al's finished 66 games, 14 minutes, 8 points, 4 rebounds, 0.3 blocks, 0.3 steals, 51 and 77. So decent percentages there from Jefferson. 53% true shooting is not ideal though. As a big man, he was cooked. He was the 278th ranked player for the season. That's up or down from 136 last year and 68th the year before and 25th the year before that. You've got a clear pattern. You want to plot those on a graph. That is a very, very steep decline from Jefferson. Only 14 minutes a game, and to be honest, down the end of the season, he was outplayed by both Rakeem Christmas and Kevin Seraphin. And when you're getting outplayed by Rakeem Christmas and Kevin Seraphin, you're finished. He has still got another year on his contract left, I believe. I think he's got might have a player option for that third year. He's definitely got at least one more year left on that contract, and he is not sniffing the top 200 anytime soon. And if the Pacers and Nate McMillan were to be serious, I think that they should be putting Seraphin and they should be putting Christmas in a position to develop into that role. He was a team worst in the regular rotation, guys, as a negative 6.6 on-off. But in saying that, Kevin Seraphin was a negative 11.3. Rakeem Christmas was negative 9.8. So neither of them were really strong either in that backup role. Of course, some of that's to do with how good Myles Turner is as their starter. But nothing about Jefferson made me go, yeah, it's just his ankle. It's just because he hurt his ankle that he's struggling. He's bad. He's finished. Maybe he comes back in as the backup and plays 15 minutes a game next season. I would be looking to develop either Christmas or Seraphin. Again, they showed quite a bit down the stretch, and I think Seraphin, especially providing a defensive option on that second unit, they need him to be that. They need him to be that guy. I'm pretty confident. I'm just reading some of the comments here on Al Jefferson at the start of the season, where people were pretty pumped about him. Al Jefferson's getting disrespected. He'll be the major source of offense off the bench. So I don't understand why his points per game have been reduced. It's because he's bad and because he's finished and because that downward trend has definitely taken hold. He's 32 years of age. Yeah, I think I've said it enough that Al Jefferson's finished as a player, as a useful player. Put that more succinctly. Lance Stephenson, 18 games he played for the season. He only played 6 of those in Indiana after bouncing around, having some severe ankle problems as well. But his 22 minutes a game, I thought they were relatively successful. 7 points, 4 rebounds, 4 assists, half a steal, 0.3 blocks. He did what he needed to do. Put up some okay numbers, apart from the 36% that he shot on twos. Where is Lance Stephenson now as a player? And it's a pretty tough question. that we need to ask. I don't really know where we're at with him. And I'm just realizing I completely misspoke earlier when I said he only hit 1 3 when he's in Indiana. He actually hit 5 of his 8 threes. So I don't know where I completely misread that stat. He hit 5 of his 8 threes in Indiana for 63%, which obviously contributed to a lot of his higher numbers there. Is he better than Monta Ellis? I think he's probably equivalent. Could he start next season? I wouldn't be stunned if that's the case. Is he going to be a top 100 fantasy player? I would have my doubts. I would have very, very high doubts. I don't think that Lance Stephenson is good, but there is no denying that he looked better in Indiana than what he had looked anywhere else that he had played. Memphis, LA, Charlotte, Minnesota. He looked a lot better in Indiana, and I don't know what it is. I know that he's got a great relationship with Larry Bird, and that's part of it. He signed on for $4 million next season as well. I think you look at him as being a guy that could crack the top 200. Maybe he cracks the top 200. I wouldn't be surprised. And his ability to get assists, 4 per game in 22 minutes in those 6 games in Indiana, and that's really useful. I could see him playing a 22-minute role on this team. I could at this point I could definitely see him being a starter on this team, and that doesn't mean that he becomes great, but I could definitely see that being the case. Have Monte run as backup point, Robinson, CJ Myles as the backup wings and fours. I can totally see that happening with Lance. He filled into the Rod Stuckey role, who wasn't able to get healthy, and he was waived, and was relatively successful. So he's a name to watch, and it's a situation to watch what they do in that guard spot to see if they can fill it in free agency or what they do. But he's a real chance to put up a top 200 season, and maybe it's not crazy to say that he could be a top 150 guy. I think top 50 is out of the question, top 75 is out of the question, and probably top 100 is. His limitations with threes and percentages, and he's not a great defensive stat guy, but those assist numbers can be super useful from Lance Stephenson. Lavoy Allen played 61 games, 14 minutes, 3 points, 3.5 rebounds, half a steal, 0.3 steals, 0.4 blocks, a disappointing 46% from the field for a big man, and 70% from the line for Lavoy. But I thought he was relatively strong in that second half of the season. He saw his ranking jump from 347th to 246th, and he looked better. He averaged 5 rebounds in 15 minutes, almost 4 points, half a block, and got his percentages up to 49 and 77 for a true shooting of 53. He's probably the better big man backup behind Thad, but some of that boost in his value after the All-Star break came because Thaddeus was injured, and he had that wrist problem that was limiting him, and Lavoy was getting those starts, and I thought that he was relatively impressive in that time. I've been a decent fan of Lavoy since his time in Philadelphia, and I know that if he plays 30 minutes a game, he is fantasy useful because he is a double-double guy who can get a block and a steal per game, and the percentages are okay. But the likelihood of him getting that role it's just not happening. I think they pick up that $4 million team option because that's good value for what he can provide. But in terms of fantasy value moving forward, I don't really see much from Lavoy. I don't think he finishes as a guy that's barely inside the top 350, which is what he did this season. I think he can jump that up a bit, especially with his rebounding proficiency, but I wouldn't be having too high hopes on him. Aaron Brooks, 65 games, 14 minutes, 5 points, 2 assists, 0.4 steals, 40, 80, and 38 for a true shooting of 51% for the season. He wasn't great at all. The team was 2.8 points per 100 possessions better off with him on the bench. Again, Monta Ellis was the better backup point guard on this team. I'm not sure that Brooks returns. I'm not sure that Brooks gets a job on another team. Maybe he does. Maybe it's as a third-string point guard. He is 32 years of age. He has declined. He struggled. He couldn't finish at the rim. He hit threes at a decent rate, but there's very little to see with Brooksy. Not even really high assist rate from him could save him or even make him close to a streamer in even 16-team leagues. As for Seraphin, I've talked about him fairly glowingly, but his numbers weren't fantastic. 5 points, 3 boards, half a block, 55 and 64% in those 11 minutes a game, true shooting of 56%. But I do like what Stephenson can do, and he is a name in, say, 20-team leagues that if they say, yeah, we're going with him as our exclusive backup, or they end up trading Jefferson in some sort of salary move or whatever, and they say that he is our backup center, then he has got that chance to become a top 250 player. I think it's a fair way off. But I was impressed with what he did, and he should have been the backup center for the majority of this season for this team, but McMillan didn't agree with me. He was horrible in terms of on-off at a negative 11.3, which is clearly not good, but I was encouraged by what we saw from Stephenson on the court. Same with Raheem Christmas, who played just one game in his rookie season, but played 28 games this season, 8 minutes, 2 points, 2 boards. It didn't do too much else. I think his fantasy upside is fairly limited. But his play on the court was marginally encouraging, and his second half of the season was a little bit stronger than what we saw at the start. But overall for fantasy, he's not, say, like a Rashawn Holmes, who he was someone that, hey, let's watch this guy, let's take a flyer on him, let's see where it goes. I don't really see that happening for Raheem. Mighty Joe Young, 4 minutes a game, 2 points, half an assist. I was pretty excited for Young. I thought that he could push into that backup point guard role. Didn't think that, before they signed Aaron Brooks, he obviously struggled in a pretty significant way, Joe Young. And I'm not sure where this leads him moving forward. He just looked bad. He is not young. He is by name, but he isn't that young. He's a 24-year-old second-year player who had a PER of 11 and a true shooting of 43%, negative win shares, a negative 7.3 box score plus minus. Those numbers are horrific. Like, they're absolutely horrific. But is there any hope for him? A negative 25.7 on-off would probably tell you no. I don't have my faith has eroded from him pretty quickly. I was in on him being a guy that could score as a backup point guard. I'm not totally out, but your league's got to be real deep. I don't know. I think I might still own him in my 400 team Red Rock Dynasty League, and I'm still holding on the hope because I've got him on a pretty cheap contract. If I still even have him, which I can't even recall. I'm running out of hope pretty quickly for Joe Young. George Niang. 23 games, 4 minutes a game. We just didn't get to see anything. He did not have one stat over 1. He averaged 0.9 points, 0.7 rebounds, and nothing else. 25% shooter, 29% true shooting. Just horrendous numbers. I cannot judge a single thing on what we saw from George Niang this season. He had a PER of 0.1, a box score plus minus of negative 12.1. He was absolutely horrendous in all statistical areas. I don't think you should have any sort of high hopes for him. He is 23 years of age already. He is a guy that in college showed the ability to handle the ball a little bit, but we saw nothing. But don't be surprised if you see him into the rotation. That happened with Raheem Christmas in his first year. Barely played. I think he played like 10 minutes for the entire year, and then slowly climbed up and played a little bit better. So maybe Niang can do that. It's almost impossible to gauge anything off what we saw from him in his rookie season, because it was just one of the worst rookie seasons that we've seen in a very long time. All right, let's crack onto the questions that you guys have got. Jordan, what is worse, Monta Ellis's or Jefferson's contract? Probably Monta, I would say. Probably Monta, but they both were not great decisions from Larry Bird. Kyle Norb, what effect do you think Larry Bird's resignation will have on the future? I don't think it'll have much. Like I said, Bird made some questionable decisions. Ellis, Jefferson, Frank Vogel, I think they were all bad decisions. That young one was a winner, but I don't think that it's going to have too much. He's going to be still around consulting. I don't think it has too much of an issue with their future. Do they have any youth other than Myles Turner with the potential to be a quality rotation player? I think that Glenn Robinson's probably that only guy. Joe Young, George Niang, I'm not interested in those guys. It probably is Glenn Robinson the third, but you're right, the future is relatively bleak, especially if Paul George leaves. It's going to be a couple of 5, 6, 7, 8 lean years, I reckon, after that. James C. Will Joe Young ever have a role in this squad? Yeah, doesn't look like it. But there is that chance, just because Brooks is 32 and a free agent. Maybe they don't acquire another backup point guard, but their lack of faith in him, or Nate McMillan's lack of faith in him this season was quite stark. And it'll have to take a pretty big turnaround in the offseason for him to now become that trusted backup point guard, especially when they're trying to make this extra push to get Paul George to stay. I don't think having Joe Young as your backup point guard is going to achieve that. All right, we're done. We're about ready for Game 3 of the NBA Finals to start. I'm predicting the Warriors to get this victory in Game 3, and then wrap it up pretty much in a sweep. I think I predicted Warriors in 5 at the start. I wouldn't be shocked if it goes to 4, but 5 is still my pick. But I think the Warriors can get this one. Don't forget, check out yesterday's show with Sam Vecini covering the NBA draft, and subscribe to this podcast. It's a great way of helping out the show, as well as checking out our sponsors, which you can always find over in the post details on redrockbasketball.com. We are done here, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Larry Bird.